Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and the Cross witnessed every sin, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. The Cross knew their crimes. He was still bleeding when they nailed him to the church door. The townspeople woke to the body just after dawn. Slumped beneath the great stone cross of St. Anselm's Chapel, arms outstretched in a grotesque imitation of crucifixion. The symbol of mercy turned into a declaration of judgment. No one knew his name. No one claimed to recognize the face. And yet, carved into his chest, with precision, almost reverence, was a single word. Witness. Father Brown stood in silence beneath the body, the wind cold against his cassock. He did not speak. He did not weep. But his eyes, those soft, deeply seeing eyes, never left the carved word on the man's chest. Not once. For in that single word, Father Brown saw something the others did not. He saw confession. He saw accusation. He saw the beginning of a punishment long overdue. The constable arrived within the hour, muttering about lunatics, vandals, and drifters with twisted minds. But Father Brown walked past him without a word and entered the chapel. There, in the flickering candlelight, something strange caught his eye. The great iron cross, centuries old, weathered by storms and softened by prayer, was different. Faint streaks of blood ran down its base, not from the body outside. No, this blood had dried long before that man had died. He touched the iron with gloved fingers, felt the weight of centuries in the metal. "This cross," he whispered, "has seen everything, and it remembers." By midday, whispers had already begun to spread through Kembleford. The body had been taken down. No one had come forward. No missing persons reports matched the man's face. He was an outsider, but not, Father Brown suspected, a stranger. He didn't come to die, he came to tell. That evening, while the villagers drank in tight circles and police stood guard around the church, Father Brown visited the archives buried beneath the rectory. Dust fell in soft curtains as he opened old records, baptismal ledgers, confession notes, and paused. An entry, long scratched out with ink so black it bled through the page, had been tucked between two newer records, as if someone had tried to erase it, and then, at the last moment, decided to hide it instead. The name was unreadable, but the date matched a fire that had destroyed part of the chapel 23 years ago. A fire officially ruled as electrical fault, but Father Brown remembered. He always remembered. There had been no storm that day, no faulty wires, just the silence of secrets smoldering into ash. He returned to the chapel just before midnight. The cross stood heavy and immovable in the moonlight, casting a long shadow across the stone floor. As he stepped closer, something shifted. The air changed, thickened, and there, in the hollow behind the altar, where the wall had cracked during the old fire, he found it. A crucifix, not decorative, hand-carved, roughly made, its edges worn by human hands. But at its base, a small compartment had been hollowed out. Inside, a rosary, burned, twisted, melted into itself, along with something else, a tooth, not an animal's, not from the crucified man. Someone had buried evidence beneath the house of God. The next morning, the bishop arrived, not to comfort the flock, but to ensure silence. "There's no need to stir up ancient dirt," he told Father Brown. "Let the past rest." But Father Brown looked him straight in the eye and asked, "What was buried beneath this chapel that still bleeds through the stone?" The bishop paled. "That fire, it destroyed everything." Father Brown didn't blink. Fires don't burn teeth. 2 days later, another word appeared, not on a body, but carved into the back pew with a blade so fine the wood curled like paper. "Return." That night, thunder cracked above Kembleford, and the rain poured down in sheets. In the confessional, a figure appeared, soaked, hooded, breathing heavily. He didn't speak his name. He simply leaned forward and said, "I saw the cross." Father Brown waited. "I was a child, the night of the fire. They said the priest died saving the chapel, that the relics were lost. But I saw it. The boy, locked in the sacristy, pounding on the inside of the door. The priest's voice was low, calm. And what did the cross do?" The man trembled. "It watched. I swear to you. I saw its shadow move. I saw its face." "There's no face on the cross." "Then why did it look away when the boy stopped screaming?" The man fled before morning. By the end of the week, 2 parishioners had left town without notice. One was a choir master, the other an organist who hadn't touched the keys since the year of the fire. The villagers began locking their doors, watching each other with quiet suspicion. Father Brown received a letter in an envelope that smelled of damp stone. Inside, a photograph, old, faded, of the chapel during a confirmation ceremony in 1903. Everyone smiled, except for the boy in the corner. His eyes looked terrified. Behind him stood the same cross, looming over the scene. Only, the cross was different. Its arms were bent upward like open arms. In every image since, they faced down. Someone had moved it, or something had moved. Then came the third message, written not in blood, not in ink, but in ashes, scattered across the pulpit floor. A single word, "Remind." That night, Father Brown dreamt of the chapel burning again. But this time, the cross walked through the fire, unburnt, and behind it, shadows screamed. He woke drenched in sweat. He rang the bell. He called the villagers back for Mass. They gathered reluctantly, their faces drawn, eyes darting to the door, the rafters, each other. He stood at the altar, his hands calm, and said, "You are not here for answers. You are here because the cross is no longer silent." And he pointed to the seat in the third row, empty for 23 years, now soaked with blood. Someone had taken communion there and left behind a scrap of cloth, embossed with the bishop's seal. Father Brown stepped outside as the bells tolled, looked once more at the cross, then said softly, "The cross knew their crimes. The question is, why did it wait so long to speak?" And in that moment, the shadow beneath the cross moved again. But no one saw it, except Father Brown. And he whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." The screen cuts to black. Silence. Then the sound of something being dragged across stone. A cross, or a body. We may never know. Chapter 2. Father Brown buried a confession. They found the confession buried beneath the floorboards of the confessional booth, sealed in wax, written in blood, and signed with Father Brown's own hand. The police thought it was a forgery. The villagers thought it was a curse. But when the bishop read the first line, he dropped the page as if it burned. "Forgive me, Father," it began, "for I have killed, and I have worn the collar while doing it." That single sentence spread through Kembleford like disease. The faithful stopped attending Mass. Mothers crossed themselves when they passed the church. Children whispered that the priest had killed someone and buried the body under the altar. By dusk, the church stood empty, except for Father Brown, kneeling alone before the cross. Outside, the wind tore at the chapel doors like something alive. Inside, Father Brown stared at the floorboards as if he could see straight through them into the grave beneath. He didn't move, didn't pray, just whispered, "I buried a confession once, but not mine." The next morning, Inspector Mallory arrived with his usual impatience. "I'm told there's a priest confessing to murder," he said, his voice cutting through the echoing nave. Father Brown looked up from the pew. "Confession," he said softly, "is not always an admission of guilt, Inspector. Sometimes it's an act of protection." Mallory snorted. "You mean someone forged this to make you look like a murderer?" Father Brown didn't answer. He simply walked to the altar, lifted the heavy candle holder, and pressed on a knot in the stone floor. It gave way with a low groan, revealing a hollow cavity lined with old paper and dust. Inside, there were several other folded pages, all yellowed with age, all sealed in the same dark wax. "Someone has been hiding sins here," Father Brown murmured, layer upon layer. Mallory unfolded one. The writing was the same, Father Brown's own careful script. But this one was dated years before he had even arrived in Kembleford. It described in exquisite and horrifying detail a murder that had taken place in 1918, a priest who had poisoned another clergyman for discovering a secret affair with a parishioner. Mallory's face paled. "This is your handwriting." Father Brown looked down at the confession, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said, "but that doesn't mean it's mine." By noon, rumors had turned into accusation. Someone had seen Father Brown digging near the cemetery late at night the week before. Someone else claimed they'd heard him whispering inside the confessional after midnight. The church that once trusted him now watched him as though he was something unholy. That evening, he went alone into the cemetery with a lantern and a spade. The air was still, almost too still. The moon hung low and red, as though it were watching. He stopped at an unmarked grave, one that had no name, no date, no flowers, only a small iron cross planted crooked in the soil. He began to dig. The sound of earth shifting was steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. He worked until his hands bled, until the lantern flickered low, and then his spade hit wood. The coffin was small, child-sized. He knelt beside it and pressed his hand against the lid. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. Then faintly, the sound of footsteps. He turned. The bishop stood at the edge of the grave, his face ghostly in the moonlight. "You shouldn't have opened it," the bishop said. "Some things are buried because they must remain buried." Father Brown's lantern sputtered out. The next morning, the grave was filled again. But the coffin was gone. No one had seen the bishop leave town, and no one saw Father Brown return to the rectory until well after dawn. When he finally stepped inside, there was dirt on his hands and blood on his cuffs. Mrs. McCarthy tried to speak, but he simply said, "I had to move it. The truth was too close to being found." That afternoon, a new envelope arrived at the rectory. No name, no address, only a seal pressed into black wax, the symbol of a cross turned upside down. Inside, one page, another confession. "He buried me alive," it read, "and I forgave him." Father Brown locked the door. He sat at his desk for a long time, reading the line over and over again. Then he reached into his drawer and pulled out a photograph, faded, torn, showing a much younger version of himself standing beside a grave. a grave with that same crooked iron cross. Mallory burst in an hour later, slamming the door open. "We found your fingerprints on the confessions, Father, every one of them." Father Brown looked up slowly. "Of course you did," he said. "Someone wanted you to." Mallory frowned. "Wanted me to?" "Yes," Father Brown said quietly, "because whoever wrote these knew that I'd be the only one who could read between the lines." He handed Mallory the most recent confession. The inspector read it aloud, his voice shaking slightly. "He buried me alive, and I forgave him." Mallory scoffed. "A lunatic's riddle." Father Brown shook his head. "No, a child's forgiveness. That's what makes it unbearable." Later that night, he returned once more to the church. He lit a single candle before the cross and waited. The candle flame bent unnaturally, as if something unseen moved beside him. Then he heard it. 3 soft knocks, not from the door, from beneath the floor. He knelt, pressing his ear to the cold stone. The knocks came again, slow, deliberate, answering him. He lifted one of the loose floor tiles and peered into the hollow beneath. For a moment, he saw nothing but shadow. Then, something glinted. Metal. A small key attached to a string, dangling from the underside of the cross itself. He took it and looked toward the confessional booth. The lock on the inner panel, which had been sealed for decades, now had a keyhole that matched. He inserted the key and turned it. The door opened with a sound like breath escaping. Inside was a small wooden box, dust-covered, bound with a strip of cloth. He opened it carefully. Inside, a single object, a child's shoe, burnt around the edges, and beneath it, another folded note. This one wasn't a confession. It was a message. "I told the truth once," it read, "and they buried me for it. Now it's your turn." He stared at it for a long time. Then the bell tower rang, though no one had pulled the rope. The next day, the villagers found Father Brown's Bible lying open on the altar. The page was marked at Psalm 32. "Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered." But Father Brown was nowhere to be found. That evening, a child wandered into the church. She said she saw someone standing in the confessional booth, whispering softly. When the constable arrived to check, the booth was empty, but the floor around it was freshly disturbed, the soil darker than the rest. They pried up the boards again. There was another box, inside, another confession. But this time, the ink was still wet. "I buried a confession," it read, "because I could not bury the truth." The writing was recent, the wax still warm, and the signature, Father Brown. Mallory locked the church and sealed the evidence, refusing to speak of it again. But every night after that, the candles in the chapel would light themselves, one by one, until the confessional glowed red from within. Some said it was wind, others said it was guilt made visible. But the few who dared to walk past after dark swore they heard a voice inside whispering, "Forgive me, Father, for I am not finished yet." Weeks passed. The town returned to its uneasy peace. Then, on the eve of Lent, the bishop returned, alone, gaunt, and trembling. He entered the church, shut the doors, and didn't emerge for hours. When he finally did, his face was pale and wet with tears. He told no one what he saw. But that night, the rectory bell rang 13 times, once for every confession ever found beneath the church. The next morning, a letter was discovered on the altar, signed in Father Brown's name. "I have learned," it read, "that confession is not always a path to redemption. Sometimes it is a grave dug with one's own words. There are truths buried beneath this church that no absolution can reach. And though I know who sinned, I cannot forgive them, because forgiveness would mean exhuming the dead, and they are not ready to be seen." The letter ended there, or perhaps it didn't, because when the constable turned the page, there was writing on the back, faint, almost erased, as though someone had tried to destroy it. "I am not the one who wrote the first confession," it said, "but I am the one who buried it." And then one final line, "The truth is still alive." After that, no one saw Father Brown again. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind rattles the stained glass and the cross groans against its mount, villagers swear they can hear digging, slow, steady, rhythmic, and beneath the floorboards of the confessional, something breathing. In the morning, when light filters through the cracked windows, there is always one new thing lying on the altar, a folded scrap of paper, wet with dew, sealed in wax. Each one bears the same message. The grave remembers. The priest does not. And though no one dares to open them anymore, they all know what they are. Confessions, written in a hand too familiar to be forgery, buried again and again by someone who cannot stop confessing what they never did. Father Brown once said, "The truth is not a light, it's a weight." Now it lies beneath the church, pressing upward through the stone, waiting to be unearthed by someone brave enough or foolish enough to ask the one question no one dares speak aloud anymore. If Father Brown buried a confession, whose sins was he trying to hide? And why does the earth still move beneath the chapel floor when no one is there? Perhaps the truth was never buried at all. Perhaps it's only waiting, because some confessions, once spoken, never stop echoing. And as the bell tolls at midnight, those echoes return, softly, steadily, until the only sound left in the dark is the whisper of a priest's voice, saying what no one else dares to admit. "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 3. The Priest Who Saw Murder. The man confessed to a crime that hadn't happened yet, and when it did, Father Brown was the only witness. He walked into the confessional just before Vespers, a stranger with a voice like sand and smoke. He didn't kneel. He didn't bless himself. He simply leaned into the grate and said, "She'll be dead by sunrise, and they'll blame the wrong man. Forgive me, Father, for what I'm about to do." Most men confess in regret. This one confessed in warning. Father Brown sat still, the thin mesh casting shadowed lines across his face. His mouth parted, but no words came. The man was already gone, slipped into the nave like breath into fog. That night, the bell in the tower rang once at precisely 3:07 a.m. It was not scheduled. No wind stirred the rope. The next morning, they found her body in the nave, laid out like a bride, white gloves, bloodless lips, and eyes wide open. She was the bishop's niece. The town froze, not because someone had died, but because someone had told them it would happen. Inspector Mallory was called immediately, and the church was sealed. But no footprints, no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry. Nothing except a single black rosary clutched in the woman's hand, a rosary that had once belonged to Father Brown. Mallory turned to him, his voice sharp and suspicious. "Care to explain why your rosary is in the dead girl's hand?" Father Brown didn't answer, not directly. He looked at the girl's face, at the serenity frozen there, and said softly, "She wasn't afraid. She knew the killer." A silence fell over the nave, so complete it seemed even the stained glass stopped breathing. But something had begun to unravel. The girl, Miss Eleanor Caldwell, had come to Kembleford only 3 days prior. She was set to be married to a young diplomat. Her fiancé had spent the night at the local inn, and he swore she had spoken to no one that evening. But Father Brown remembered otherwise. He had seen her enter the chapel after sundown, alone, wrapped in a pale blue shawl, and someone had followed her, barely a shadow in the doorway. The problem was, the door had been locked from the inside. The more Mallory pressed, the more the case twisted. Eleanor had no enemies, no scandals, no debts. Yet someone had known she would be alone. Someone had known to place her just beneath the nave's highest window, where the moonlight always fell brightest. And that rosary. Father Brown had lost it over 2 decades ago, during a mission in Belgium. It had never resurfaced, until now. That evening, Father Brown returned to the confessional and sat in the exact seat where the stranger had spoken. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Why did you come to me?" The answer came not in words, but in memory, a scent, the faintest trace of pipe smoke lingering in the wood. He leaned forward, pressed his fingers along the carved panel, and found something, a mark scratched into the side. A symbol, not religious, not random. It was an eye, enclosed in a triangle. He'd seen it once before, in a sealed confession, a file that was never meant to be opened again. He unlocked the rectory safe that night and pulled out the envelope marked G. Wallingford, denied absolution. Inside, a letter, not typed, not signed, just one line. "If you ever see the symbol again, you'll know what I did wasn't a sin. It was a warning." Wallingford. That name hadn't been spoken in over 30 years. A man excommunicated for claiming the church was infiltrated. A priest who vanished days before a cardinal was found dead in Rome ruled suicide. But Father Brown had always suspected otherwise. Now the symbol had returned, and Eleanor Caldwell was dead. He followed the thread. The bishop had sealed Wallingford's file himself. The bishop, whose niece had just died holding a priest's rosary. Father Brown didn't accuse. He never did. He simply asked, "What was Wallingford trying to warn you about?" The bishop didn't flinch. He stared out the stained glass window and whispered, "There are secrets older than both of us, Father. Secrets that were buried in Vatican stone and should have stayed there." Then a knock at the rectory door. A courier. No return address. A box. Inside, an audio reel, old and brittle. On the tape, a recording, barely audible. A voice, female, crying. Then, "He said the cross isn't watching anymore. He said it turned away. He said it's our turn to be judged." Then silence. Father Brown took the reel to the chapel's old player and listened again. Over and over. Each time, the final words burned deeper. The cross turned away. What did that mean? He returned to the chapel at midnight. Candles lit themselves as he entered. No wind, no matches, just flame. He walked to the confessional. The door creaked open. The grate where the stranger had spoken now had another symbol etched into it. Fresh, sharp, bleeding rust. A hand reaching out of a grave. Below it, scrawled hastily in pencil, "I saw him kill her." The question was no longer who. The question was why was the priest allowed to witness it? Father Brown, for the first time in years, felt afraid, not of death, but of memory. He had seen something, not last night, years ago. Another girl, another church, a figure in white, and a second figure, hooded, trembling, weeping as he held a blade. He hadn't understood it then. But now, the pieces fit. The killer wasn't a man. It was a vow, a promise made in shadow, a covenant sworn in blood, to kill only when the church turned its back. And someone had given permission. Eleanor Caldwell had stumbled upon something, perhaps not intentionally, perhaps only by accident, But she saw it, she heard it, and they let her die in front of the cross because they believed it no longer cared. Father Brown stood before the altar and whispered, "If you are still watching, show me." The great stained glass window cracked down the middle. A sound like thunder split the air, and from the ceiling rafters, something fell. Not a body, a pendant. The bishop's. He had lied. He'd said he hadn't spoken to Eleanor, but the pendant had her blood on it. It wasn't enough to accuse, not in the court, but it was enough to know. Father Brown returned to the confessional and found a final note tucked beneath the seat. "You saw it too. You must speak." He burned it, because truth was no longer safe. The next morning, the bishop was gone. No trace, no letter, no explanation. The Vatican issued a bland statement. Travel, retirement, illness, nothing real, nothing true. Inspector Mallory closed the case as a robbery gone wrong. No one believed it, but no one asked more questions, except the boy. A child from the orphanage, the one who had seen Eleanor enter the church that night. He said she wasn't alone. He said she smiled at the man beside her. "Was he tall?" Father Brown asked. "No, he was small, thin, scared." Wallingford. Wallingford hadn't died. Wallingford had come back, but not to kill, to stop a killing, and he had failed. Father Brown sat in the chapel long after the candles had gone cold. He stared at the crack in the stained glass. The eye at the center was missing now, gone, erased, as if it had never been watching at all. And softly, just once, he whispered to himself, "I saw the murder too, but I still don't know if I was meant to stop it, or to witness it." Outside, the bell tolled once. No one had pulled the rope. The reel kept playing in the rectory, stuck on that final line. The cross turned away, and maybe, just maybe, so had God. The screen fades to black. A single breath is heard, and the voice of Father Brown, whispering once more, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 4. She prayed before killing him. She lit a candle for his soul. 3 minutes before she slid the knife between his ribs. The sacristy was quiet that evening, bathed in soft amber light and the faint scent of lilies left behind from the funeral mass earlier that morning. No one saw her enter. No one saw her kneel. But someone heard the whisper, "Forgive me, Father, for what I'm about to do." The next time anyone saw her, she was standing calmly beside the altar, her hands still trembling from the prayer, not the murder. He was slumped across the communion rail, his blood soaking into the velvet cloth, his mouth open in surprise, not pain. There was no struggle, no cry, just the soft scrape of blade against bone, and silence where a hymn should have been. The victim was Henry Lockridge, the beloved choirmaster of St. Anselm's. He had been serving the church for 20 years. A gentleman, quiet, trusted. Everyone called him St. Henry. But someone had wanted him dead, badly enough to kill him inside the very house of God. And worse, they did it after praying. Inspector Mallory arrived at the chapel, red-faced and irritated, muttering something about sick minds and theatrical murders. But Father Brown said nothing. He stood near the altar, hands folded, eyes narrowed at the single extinguished candle, the one that had burned for exactly 3 minutes too short. It was not one of the sanctuary candles. It had been brought in. Small, white, personal. A candle meant for mourning, not ritual. A candle someone had brought with the intention of saying goodbye. The knife wasn't found at the scene. No fingerprints, no blood trail, no sign of forced entry. Nothing but the wax pooling at the base of the candle and the faint imprint of a woman's heel on the edge of the prayer kneeler. Mallory scoffed. "Another ghost, Father? Or are your murderers getting bolder?" But Father Brown turned to him slowly and said, "She came to mourn, Inspector, not to kill, at least not at first. The funeral lilies were the clue." Father Brown knew the arrangements. He had blessed the casket that morning, but the bouquet placed near the organ was not from the service. It had no card, no ribbon, just fresh-cut lilies in a vase from the old rectory kitchen, one that hadn't been used in over a decade, and that vase had belonged to Edith Rainsford. Edith Rainsford had vanished 13 years ago. She had sung in Lockridge's choir as a girl, a soprano, gifted, too gifted. Rumors had floated then. Nothing proved, but the day after she vanished, Lockridge was found in his office with a broken hand and no explanation. The police said she'd run away. Her family said she'd married and moved abroad. But Father Brown remembered the silence that followed her disappearance. How Lockridge never played another solo hymn. How her photograph had been removed from the choir wall. Not replaced, erased. And now, 13 years later, someone had placed her old vase, by the organ, as if to say, "I was here." The next day, a letter arrived at the rectory. No return address, no name, just a single page. 3 lines. "He told me I was chosen. I believed him. Then I prayed for God to let me forget." Mallory dismissed it as madness. Grief-stricken relative, probably. Someone with a flair for the dramatic. Father Brown didn't argue. Instead, he asked for the list of names at the funeral that morning. 23 guests, but one stood out. A woman registered under the name Mrs. Eleanor Watts. No one knew her. She didn't speak to anyone. She sat in the last pew and left before the recessional hymn. There were no records of an Eleanor Watts living in Kembleford. No death records tied to her. No known relatives. But Father Brown remembered something. 13 years ago, after Edith Rainsford disappeared, her younger sister had gone to live with an aunt. That aunt's name was Watts. He went to the chapel that night, alone, and opened the old choir registry. Dust rose like breath from the pages. He found Edith's name. Then beneath it, barely visible in faded ink, Marianne Rainsford. She had been 12. The lilies, the candle, the letter, the false name. Marianne hadn't just returned to grieve. She had come back to finish what her sister never could. The next morning, the police found another letter, this time pinned to the chapel door with a communion pin. It read, "I begged God to strike him down. When he didn't, I realized he wanted me to do it." Mallory was furious. "So now God's giving people permission to kill?" Father Brown said softly. "No. But when silence becomes unbearable, sometimes vengeance sounds like heaven." He walked the chapel with new eyes. The kneeler had another mark now, a small smear of candle wax crushed into the velvet, and on the edge, a strand of hair, blonde, dyed, not old. He returned to the choir loft and found the organ untouched, but in the tuning chamber behind it, a place only the choir master and a few singers would know, he found something buried beneath the boards, a hymn book. Edith's. Her name scratched out, every page slashed except one. Hymn 47. "Deliver us, O Lord, from silence." The next page was torn out, and in its place, taped crudely, shaking hands, was a photograph. Edith, standing next to Lockridge, her smile forced, his hand resting too tightly on her shoulder. There was more. On the back of the photo, "She told me, I didn't listen." The story was unraveling now. Father Brown went to the bishop. He asked for access to the confessional archive. The bishop hesitated. That file was sealed. Father Brown replied, but it was never absolved. Reluctantly, the bishop produced the tape, a recording from 13 years ago. Confessions aren't recorded anymore, but for a brief period, during a rash of crimes, the Vatican had allowed an exception. The voice on the tape was quiet, young, terrified. I told him I wasn't ready. I told him I wanted to sing, not that. He said the choir was the only place God would hear me. Then sobbing, he said if I told anyone, they'd believe him, not me. Then silence. The tape cut off. No name, no confirmation. But it was Edith. Everyone knew. And now, someone had made sure the church finally heard her. That night, Father Brown sat in the pew alone. The storm outside raged against the stained glass. Thunder echoed through the chapel like the sound of judgment, long delayed. He whispered into the shadows. She prayed before she killed him, because she still hoped for mercy. Then, from the back of the chapel, a soft voice. But she didn't get it, did she? Father Brown turned. It was Marianne, soaked in rain, pale, calm. I wanted to believe, she said, walking forward. For 13 years I wanted to believe that someone else would do it, that justice would come, but it didn't. You killed him here, Father Brown said quietly. I forgave him first, she said. I prayed. I lit the candle. And when I realized God was still silent, I did what had to be done. She reached into her coat and placed something on the altar. The missing page from the hymn book. On it, scribbled in ink. I asked for light. I found silence. I became flame. Father Brown didn't call the police. Not that night. He let her speak. Let her cry. Let her leave. He never said where she went. Never told Mallory what she confessed. But when asked, years later, if the killer was ever caught, Father Brown simply said, she confessed before she ever sinned. And when asked again who killed Henry Lockridge, he said, I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Outside, the candle that had gone out still sits in the sacristy, and some nights it lights itself. Chapter 5. Secrets bled beneath the altar. They only discovered the heart when the blood began to seep through the stone. At first, it was dismissed as damp, old moisture rising beneath the altar tiles of St. Anselm's. But when the sacristan lifted the cloth and found a red stain that hadn't been there the night before, thick, almost pulsing, he screamed. By the time Father Brown arrived, the crimson had traced a perfect circle around the altar's base, soaking into the linen like it had bled from the stone itself. The altar, sacred and centuries old, had become a wound, and the church, once a place of peace, now felt like a body hiding a violent death. Mallory was called, the stone was lifted. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, sealed in wax, and buried in a cavity no one had known existed, they found it. A box. Inside, a heart. Preserved. Human. The forensic pathologist said it had been removed post-mortem, likely years ago, and kept in conditions designed to stop decomposition. But there was something even more disturbing. A silver ring, embedded between the heart's ventricles, etched with Latin script, Dominus meus et omnia, my Lord and my everything. The ring belonged to Father Marcus Ruel, a priest who had disappeared 6 years earlier under mysterious circumstances. He had served at St. Anselm's. He had vanished after reporting irregularities in church finances, and more disturbingly, after requesting an inquiry into the private activities of the previous bishop. His disappearance had been ruled a suicide. A letter, unsigned but typed, had been left behind, claiming despair and shame. No body was found. No investigation followed. The church buried the scandal, and now his heart had returned. Father Brown stared at the box for a long time, not with fear, but with recognition. "This isn't a murder," he said. "It's a message." He asked for the altar records, the architectural schematics, the blueprints of every restoration. They were incomplete. Pages had been removed, dates altered. Worse, the original altar plans had been signed not by any mason or engineer, but by the bishop himself. A man long dead, a man buried beneath the chapel. But when they opened the crypt to verify his remains, they found an empty coffin filled with stones. Secrets don't stay buried beneath altars by accident. They are placed there, sealed under sacred ground, because someone believes it will never be disturbed. That night, Father Brown stood alone in the dark church, staring at the blood-stained stone. He touched it gently, and something strange happened. The lights flickered, the walls seemed to close in, and he heard, as clearly as if it had come from the pulpit itself, a whisper. "You swore never to dig." He didn't sleep. The next day, the entire altar was dismantled. Beneath the foundation, they found bones, not all of them human. A dog, a fox, a child, each wrapped in cloth, each with a note, each labeled with a single name and a date. None of the names were listed in the church's burial register. One note had only 2 words: "I failed." Mallory wanted answers. Father Brown gave none. Instead, he requested access to the confessional archive. Again, he found a file marked Ruel. Inside, only 1 page. "I saw what was under the altar," the confession read. "I begged them to exhume it. They told me the altar is not just a table, it is a seal, and if I broke it, I would not be buried. I would be consumed." The last line, "If I disappear, look under his body." The altar at St. Anselm's had always had a crucifix above it, but behind the crucifix, something Father Brown had never noticed before, was a small iron ring, bolted into the wall, a handle. He climbed the ladder and twisted it. The wall groaned, and a compartment opened. Inside, a journal. Father Marcus's. Pages damp, ink faded, but legible. He had written about the bishop's rituals, midnight rites, strange chants, parishioners disappearing, and always the phrase, "The altar must be fed." At first, Father Marcus thought it was metaphorical. Then he wrote of blood, of bodies, of a night when he woke to the sound of stone grinding, and saw figures in red robes carrying something limp and wrapped in white beneath the altar. That was the night he wrote, "I can no longer call this a house of God." The last entry, "If I do not survive this night, know that my heart is still here." Father Brown closed the journal and said quietly, "It never left." But who had buried the heart? And why now? The altar had not been disturbed for 6 years. Then, 1 week before the blood appeared, a new deacon had arrived, a man named Thomas Bevan, soft-spoken, kind, and with a background that checked out. Except for one thing, his seminary file was sealed, and the only signature on his recommendation letter was forged. Father Brown confronted him in the sacristy. "Why did you come here, Thomas?" he asked. The deacon didn't lie. He smiled sadly. "I came to watch the blood rise." He wasn't arrested. He wasn't detained. He simply left. And that night, the altar cracked. The crack ran straight down the middle. Beneath it, a single word carved into the foundation: "Confess." A week later, another letter. This one not sent to the rectory, but left in Father Brown's personal Bible. No envelope, just paper, stained with something darker than ink. "You cannot serve 2 masters," it read. "You buried the heart once. Will you bury it again?" Father Brown fell to his knees because he remembered. 6 years ago, He had been called in the dead of night, a body on the chapel steps, still warm. He had been told not to ask questions, that Father Marcus had confessed to delusion, that he had taken his own life, that the church would bury the scandal and the body. And Father Brown, still young, still obedient, still afraid of losing his calling, had helped seal the box. He had not known it was only the heart, but he had helped. And now the church was bleeding, and the altar had split, and a voice whispered in his head, "You are the secret, Father. You are the seal." When asked by Mallory who was responsible, Father Brown did not give a name. He only said, "A church is not just a building. It is a wound, and we've been bleeding for a long time." The heart was reburied, but this time not beneath the altar. It was given a grave, a name, a stone. But still, the church does not rest. The candles extinguish themselves at midnight. The bells toll without wind, and beneath the cracked altar, the blood never dries completely. Because secrets, once buried, do not die. They wait, and one day they rise. Father Brown once said, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And perhaps that's because the truth still bleeds. Chapter 6. He died holding a rosary. They found his body slumped beneath the bell tower, eyes wide open, mouth parted in silent horror, and in his hands, clenched so tightly the beads had broken the skin, was a blood-soaked rosary that hadn't been seen since the night of the first murder. The dead man's name was Dominic Hale, a historian sent from the diocese to catalogue relics from the older part of St. Anselm's. He was not a local. No one knew him well. He spoke quietly, took his tea black, and walked the graveyard alone, at dusk with a notebook and a lantern. He wasn't supposed to die. He wasn't supposed to know. And yet, when the coroner pried open his frozen fingers, the broken rosary inside wasn't just a clue, it was a confession. Because that rosary belonged to Father Alaric Baines, a priest who had died 10 years ago, reportedly of natural causes, and who had been buried with that very rosary draped over his chest. So how had it ended up in the hands of a man found dead behind a locked tower door? And why were 3 of the beads missing, each one replaced with something else? A fingernail, a tooth, and a folded scrap of paper that simply said, "He was awake when it began." Inspector Mallory was furious. "Are we dealing with grave robbers now, Father?" he spat, pacing beside the cracked bell ropes. "Or just someone who likes to play priest in the dark?" But Father Brown didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed on the blood pooled beneath Hale's body. Not because of the violence, but because the pattern it had made. Not random, not chaotic. It had soaked into the floor in the shape of a cross turned sideways, as if someone had dragged it, twisted it, as if the symbol itself had resisted being recognized. It was too clean, too placed. And the rosary, why was it still wet with blood, even though Hale had been dead for hours? Father Brown returned to the rectory that night with a heaviness in his chest. There was something about Dominic Hale that no one had seen, something he had learned in his quiet walks among the graves, something the church did not want unearthed. He opened the dead man's notebook, found beneath the pew where he often sat. On the first page, a name was scrawled and circled 3 times, Amelia Croft. She had been buried 50 years ago. No headstone, no family left. Just a faded entry in the church registry marked unbaptized, unsanctified, denied. No details, no cause of death. But Father Brown remembered her. She was 15, and she had died inside the church. The story had always been vague. She was a servant girl, orphaned, mute. found dead one morning beneath the altar, hands folded, a rosary between them that didn't belong to her. The official cause was listed as collapse from illness. But Father Brown, then a young curate, had arrived days after, only to hear hushed voices and see altar boys scrubbing at stains that didn't wash away. Now, that rosary had returned. Dominic Hale must have found her grave, dug deeper, not into the earth, but into the church's records. He must have uncovered the truth, and someone had silenced him before he could speak it. The next day, something even more disturbing surfaced. The bell tower door had been locked from the inside. There was no other exit, no broken glass, no disturbed dust near the floorboards. Dominic Hale had not been dragged there. He had walked in willingly, and the person who had killed him, if it was a person, had never left. Mallory scoffed. So what? He slit his own throat to protect a 50-year-old secret? But Father Brown said nothing, because he had seen the body. And the wound wasn't clean. It was jagged, like something had clawed across the neck, not cut it. And then there was the bell. It had rung once, loudly, at 3:03 a.m., the same time Amelia Croft's death had been recorded. The bell hadn't rung in years. Its rope was brittle, its mechanism jammed. But that night, something had made it ring. Father Brown returned to the crypt that evening, descended alone. Beneath the chapel, beneath even the catacombs, there was a sealed chamber, one only a few clergy knew of. The quiet room, they called it, where heretics were once kept, where confessions too dangerous to record had been buried in ink and prayer. He found a ledger, dust-covered, bound in rotting leather. Inside, a list of names, each with a date, each with a symbol beside it. Most were crosses, some were stars, but one had something else, a bleeding eye. Next to it, Croft, Amelia. Refused confession, cursed tongue, bound under bell tower, bound, not buried, bound. Hale hadn't found her grave, he had found her name, and something, or someone, had made sure he could go no further. The rosary was never hers, but perhaps it had been meant for her, or for whoever, or whatever, had silenced her. That night, as Father Brown prayed in the nave, a low sound echoed through the walls. Not the bell, something softer, like beads dragging across stone. He turned and found the confessional curtains swaying gently, though the air was still. Inside, on the seat, sat a single object, one of the missing beads from the rosary. No blood this time, just cold. He picked it up. Beneath it, etched into the wood, were the same words from the paper found on Hale. He was awake when it began. Who was he, and what had begun? The next morning, the coroner's report came in. Hale's lungs had not collapsed from blood loss. They had filled with ash, dry, ancient. Not smoke, not dust. Ash. Something had burned inside him. Father Brown opened the church registry again, looked back further. 51 years, 52. He found another Croft, Father Elias Croft, Amelia's father, defrocked for heresy and cruelty, died in confinement. But the date of death? Same day, same hour, same minute. 3:03 a.m. Amelia hadn't just died. She had taken him with her. Now, all these years later, the rosary had returned, and another man had died clutching it. The pattern was too precise, too cruel. The church bells rang again that night. 3 chimes, then silence. When Father Brown entered the chapel, he saw them, the remaining 2 beads, one on the pulpit, one on the altar, each with a single word carved beneath. Forgive. Remember. And suddenly, he understood. The rosary wasn't just a token of faith. It was a map, a countdown. Every bead represented a witness. Every missing bead, a secret taken to the grave. Only one bead remained. his own. He looked down at the blood-stained floor, at the claw marks etched near the base of the crucifix, at the scripture carved not into the stone, but into flesh, on Hale's chest. Not Latin, not scripture, just one line. She hears your prayers now. And suddenly, the silence wasn't comforting, it was listening. Mallory arrived too late. The chapel had already sealed itself. The doors refused to open. The lights would not stay on. And Father Brown, he knelt before the altar, whispered a final prayer, then placed the last bead on the broken chain. The bell rang one final time, louder than it ever had. When the doors were finally forced open at dawn, the church was empty. No body, no blood, only the rosary, whole again, lying in the center of the nave, and on the last page of Dominic Hale's notebook, a new line had been added in handwriting that wasn't his. He died holding a rosary, but she never let go. No one speaks Amelia's name anymore, but sometimes, in the stillness of prayer, the beads grow warm in the hand, and one by one, the faithful begin to forget their words, because the rosary is listening, and the truth it carries is not of this world. Father Brown once said, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And some mysteries are better left between the fingers of the dead. Chapter 7. The Confession that Condemned Him. He confessed to a murder that hadn't happened yet, and when it finally did, his name was carved into the corpse's skin. It began on a Sunday evening, during the quiet hours after Vespers. The church smelled of candle wax and dust. Father Brown was closing the doors when a man stumbled in from the rain, soaked to the bone, shaking, his face pale as chalk. He didn't say a word. He just walked straight to the confessional and knelt down. The screen between them clicked shut. Then came the voice, hoarse, frightened, but determined. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," he whispered, "and I will sin again." Father Brown's hands froze mid-blessing. "Go on, my son." "There will be a death," the man said. "Tomorrow night, a man who deserves to die, but when they find him, they'll think it was you." And before Father Brown could speak again, the man said one final thing, soft, trembling, almost tender. "You already know his name." The door creaked open. Footsteps echoed, and by the time Father Brown emerged, the church was empty. Only the faint smell of iron and damp lingered behind. The next morning, word spread across Kembleford like wildfire. A man had been found dead in the river, head split open, rosary wound tight around his neck. The victim was Edward Lacey, a solicitor, a man known for his arrogance and greed, the kind who measured faith in money and forgiveness in favors. But what stunned everyone wasn't the brutality of the murder. It was what the police found in his pocket. A letter addressed to the parish priest, Father Brown. Mallory stormed into the rectory, waving the soaked envelope like a weapon. "A coincidence, Father, or something holier?" Inside the letter, written in smeared ink, were 3 words: "I forgive you." No signature, no explanation. The confession that condemned him had already begun its work. By afternoon, the newspapers had caught on. Priest linked to mysterious death. Parishioners whispered. Some refused to enter the chapel. Others left offerings at the gate, praying the devil had not taken up residence within. But Father Brown said nothing. He only stood at the riverbank that evening, watching the water slide past like a serpent. There, at the edge of the mud, glinted something half-buried, a cufflink, gold, engraved with a cross, but not his. It belonged to the bishop. He picked it up quietly, wrapped it in his handkerchief, and looked toward the rectory window. Someone was watching him. That night, the church bell rang at an ungodly hour. 3 times, slow and deliberate. Father Brown rose from bed, lit his lantern, and entered the nave. The air was thick, heavy, with something old. The confessional door was ajar. Inside sat the same man from before, or so he thought. But when Father Brown drew closer, the light fell across the figure's face, and he saw it wasn't him at all. It was Edward Lacey, dead, eyes wide open, lips curled into a faint, unnatural smile, and in his right hand, clutched as if he'd died praying, was a page torn from the parish's confessional record. The line written there read, in Father Brown's handwriting, "He will kill again." Mallory arrived within minutes, grim and red-faced. "Explain this, Father. How does a dead man walk into your church?" Father Brown only whispered, "He didn't walk. He was brought." But who could have done it? The church doors were locked from the inside, the windows sealed, no footprints in the wet soil outside, only the faint scent of incense that hadn't been used in weeks. Then came the telegram. Anonymous, short, terrifying. "You buried the first lie. Don't bury the second." Father Brown's pulse quickened, because he had buried something once, something only he and God knew. Years ago, before Kembleford, a different parish, a different sin, a confession so monstrous it had driven him to question everything he believed in. He remembered the face of the man who had confessed it. Dark eyes, trembling hands, the smell of guilt soaked into his clothes. The man who had whispered, "If I die, you'll know I told the truth." And now he realized the voice in the confessional last night was the same. That man was supposed to be dead. He went to the archives, searching through old parish records, old letters, any trace of the name he feared would appear again. And there it was, Michael Trevors, former seminarian, excommunicated, declared insane, died in confinement. But the death certificate had no seal, no witness, just a date and the bishop's signature, the same bishop whose cufflink had been found in the river mud. Father Brown went to the bishop's residence at once. Midnight. Rain pounding on the windows like 1,000 fingers. The bishop greeted him calmly, as though expecting him. "You've been restless," he said. "You signed Trevors's death," Father Brown said. The bishop smiled faintly. "He was already dead when I did." "Then who buried him?" Silence. And then the bishop said something that chilled him to his core. "Some confessions, Father, are not made to God. They are made to protect him." Father Brown stared at him. "And what about Lacey? What sin was his death meant to protect?" The bishop poured wine into a glass. Lacey was going to speak to the press. About the fund. About the missing money. He thought faith could be bought. He was wrong. But killing him? The bishop looked up. "You think I killed him?" Then he smiled. "No, Father, you did." And he handed him something wrapped in cloth. Father Brown unwrapped it with trembling hands. It was his own pen, the one used to record confessions, and on the nib, a smear of blood. Father Brown staggered back. "What is this?" "Your handwriting is on the page they found in his hand," the bishop said softly. "Your pen wrote it, your church held him, and your silence, your beautiful, holy silence, buried him." Father Brown's heart pounded. "Someone is trying to destroy me." The bishop leaned forward. "No, Father. Someone is trying to save you." He left that night shaken to his soul. Every step echoed with doubt. Every candle flicker seemed to whisper that terrible phrase. He confessed to a murder, that hadn't happened yet. The next day, Mallory arrived with a new piece of evidence. A photograph found in Lacey's office. Faded. Torn. It showed the bishop and Father Brown together at a church dedication years ago. Behind them, in the shadow, stood another man, barely visible. Michael Trevors, alive. The photograph was dated the same year Trevors was supposedly buried. Father Brown felt the air leave his lungs. "It's not possible," Mallory frowned. "Then explain why he's standing behind you both, Father." Later that night, Father Brown found the old confessional ledger again. He flipped through the pages, heart pounding faster with every line. One entry, unsigned, written in jagged ink, read, "He made me confess his crime. I spoke it aloud so he would be forgiven. But he left me there, condemned." And beneath it, in smaller handwriting, his own, Father Brown had written, "Absolved." He didn't remember writing that word. Not truly. Had he been the one who condemned him? Or absolved him? Was it possible that Trevors had killed Lacey to expose the truth, and that Father Brown's old confession, his own words, had damned them both? The church grew colder that night. He sat before the altar, whispering, "If you're still alive, show me." And then he heard it. 3 knocks, not on the door, on the inside of the confessional. When he opened it, there was no one there, just a new page in the ledger, ink still wet. "You heard me once. Hear me again." The next morning, the bishop's body was found in his study. Heart attack, they said, but his mouth was open, his tongue blackened, his hand clutching the same rosary Lacey had died with. And beside him, an envelope addressed to Father Brown. Inside, a single sentence. "He told me what you confessed." Father Brown's eyes filled with tears. He whispered, "Then you already know it wasn't me." But the letter continued, "That's why I had to stop you before you said it again." That was when Father Brown understood the truth too terrible to speak. Trevors hadn't been trying to expose the church. He'd been trying to save it. He had confessed to murders he hadn't committed so that the real murderer, the bishop, could live free of suspicion. Each false confession bought the church time. Each death was disguised as penance. Until Father Brown's own faith, his silence, became the perfect weapon. He was the last confession, the final absolution. And now there was only one way to end it. He burned the ledger, watched the ink melt into nothing, watched the ghosts it contained lose their voices. And then, as the flames died, he whispered one final prayer. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned by keeping silent." The church bells tolled at dawn. The confessional booth stood empty. But if you listened closely, beneath the echoes, beneath the wind, you could still hear the faint sound of a man's voice on the other side of the grate, whispering words no one should ever speak. "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 8. Father Brown heard a lie. The man who confessed had an alibi. He'd been dead for 12 years. It began on an ordinary evening in the chapel at St. Anselm's. The candles were burning low, casting long shadows on the marble floor, and the air was still, expectant, the kind of quiet that only exists right before something breaks. The church was empty, until the side door creaked open, and a man in a grey coat walked in. He didn't kneel, he didn't cross himself, he simply sat in the confessional and waited. Father Brown, already inside, gave the traditional greeting. But what came next was not tradition, it was terror. "I am the one who killed them," the man whispered. "All 3, the priest, the girl, the man by the river. I slit their throats like scripture." Father Brown's breath caught. The girl by the river, Eleanor Caldwell, had been found months ago. The priest, Father Marcus, 6 years dead. The man by the river, Dominic Hale, recent, all unsolved, all terrifying. But now, someone was claiming them. One man, one voice, one monster. Father Brown listened in horrified silence as the man listed names, details never released to the press, facts only the killer could know. And then, as suddenly as he had begun, the man said one final sentence. "You'll never find my body, but you'll find his." Father Brown emerged from the confessional shaken to his core, but when he stepped into the chapel, it was empty. No grey coat, no scent, no echo of footsteps, as if the man had vanished into the stones. He reported the confession immediately, but Mallory was skeptical. "Another madman? We've had those before," Father Brown insisted. This man knew everything. Names, times, wounds. He even mentioned the rosary from the tower. Mallory sighed. "Fine, we'll pull prints, check the church logs. Maybe someone saw him." But no one had. The door hadn't been unlocked. The candles hadn't flickered. No footprints, no sound. And then it got worse. Father Brown checked the death register from 12 years ago. Something about the voice. It gnawed at his memory. And there it was, Graham Holloway. Died 12 years earlier. A local schoolteacher. Devout, gentle, but accused in private whispers of things too vile to speak in church. He had died under unusual circumstances. No autopsy, buried in haste. And when Father Brown found the obituary, his blood ran cold. The photo. It was the man in the confessional. Exactly as he appeared. No aging, no change. The same haunted eyes, the same grey coat. It wasn't a confession, it was a visitation. The next day, the grave of Graham Holloway was exhumed. What they found inside wasn't a body, it was two. One decayed beyond recognition, but the other, fresh, preserved, eyes open, and a note clutched in the skeletal hand. It read, "This one lied, but I didn't." Mallory refused to believe it. Someone's playing a sick joke, dressing up bodies, digging up graves. For what? Attention? But Father Brown sat alone in the chapel that night, staring at the confessional, because he knew the voice, not from the living, but from a confession he'd heard as a young priest years ago in a different town, a different church. A man had once confessed to killing his own brother and then begged to be forgotten. He had died the next day. A suicide. That man's name was Graham Holloway. So how had he returned? And more terrifying, why was he lying now? Father Brown listened again to the recording. He always recorded his confessions with permission, for review. He slowed it down, listened for inflection, breath, patterns, and then he caught it. A skip, not in the audio, in the voice. It repeated a phrase, but not perfectly, as if imitating speech, not creating it, like an echo, trained to sound like guilt. Father Brown checked the waveform. There was interference, static, but not mechanical, rhythmic, like a breath. No human breath, like something else. The next morning, a letter arrived at the rectory. No stamp, no handwriting, just a typed message. "He's telling the truth now, but he wasn't supposed to." And in the envelope, a finger, preserved in salt. The print matched Edward Lacey, but Lacey had been buried months ago, whole, intact. They exhumed the body, the hand was gone. Inside the coffin, another note. "He lied to you, Father, so I told the truth." Father Brown could barely breathe. It wasn't about guilt anymore. It was about control. Someone was using confessions as currency, trading sins, swapping bodies, rewriting guilt. And he was the bank. He returned to the ledger, the master book of recorded confessions over 20 years. Flipping through page after page of grief and redemption, he saw it. A pattern. Every 6 years, a lie. Every 6 years, a death. And in every 6th year, a confession was heard by a man who shouldn't have been there. Graham Holloway, 6 years apart. Always him, always with a new crime, a new name, a new truth, and always something left behind. Flesh, a tooth, a rosary, a name carved into stone. Father Brown checked the dates. 6 years ago, Father Marcus. 12 years ago, the bishop's assistant. 18 years ago, the boy from the orphanage. Each death, each lie, each connected to a confession, each heard by him, Father Brown. The next night, the confessional lit itself. No candles were lit, no people entered, but the booth glowed. He walked toward it, heart hammering. Inside, no man sat, no figure waited, but on the seat lay a new page, a confession, written in his own hand, dated tomorrow, and it read, "I lied to protect the church. I buried the truth under the altar. I watched the innocent die. I absolved the guilty. I feared the voice that returned. I heard the lie, and I said, Amen." Father Brown fell to his knees, because he remembered now. The real first confession, the one never recorded, the one Graham Holloway gave before his suicide, the one Father Brown never wrote down, because the truth was too vile, and the lie too comforting. But someone had remembered, and now the lie was alive, not as a ghost, as a voice, possessing the truth, speaking through mouths long buried. And every time Father Brown heard it, he had nodded, listened, written it down, let it live. The next morning, Inspector Mallory arrived to find the church doors wide open. No sign of Father Brown. Just a tape recorder left on the pulpit. It played one sentence, over and over. "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And outside, beneath the statue of the Virgin, a new stone had been placed. No name, just a single word, confessor. Some say Father Brown died that night. Others believe he left, in shame or madness. But sometimes, in the dead hours before dawn, the confessional creaks open on its own. And if you dare to enter, you'll hear a voice whisper something that sounds like mercy, until it tells your story back to you, word for word, lie for lie. And when it does, you'll finally understand why Father Brown never spoke again. Chapter 9. The widow hid the crucifix. They buried him with a rosary in his hands, unaware that the crucifix, the one stained with the blood of 2 unsolved murders, was hidden beneath the widow's bed. The funeral was quiet, too quiet, like the whole village of Kembleford had agreed to forget what had really happened. Charles Redgrave had died a week ago. Heart attack, they said. Peaceful, painless. But Father Brown had seen the look in the widow's eyes when she refused to let the coroner near the body. He had seen how tightly her fingers clutched the prayer cloth, how she trembled when he sprinkled the holy water over the coffin. And most of all, he had seen her flinch when he placed the crucifix on the altar, not the one she brought from home, but the chapel's own. Because that wasn't the crucifix her husband died with. That one, old, tarnished, and chipped at the base, had disappeared, just like the others. 3 deaths in 2 months. All sudden, all deemed natural. And in every case, the same detail whispered through the edges of the autopsy. Something clenched tightly in the hands. Something sharp, cold, and sacred. But no crucifix had ever been found. Not officially, not by the police, because someone had hidden them. Someone who believed they were too powerful to be seen. The widow, Clara Redgrave, never cried. Not once. She wore black, spoke in soft tones, accepted condolences with grace, but she never shed a single tear. Father Brown had seen grief in all its forms, hysterical, numb, reverent. But Clara's was rehearsed, beautiful, false. 2 days after the funeral, a child from the village wandered into the rectory with a strange question. "Father," she said, "why does Mrs. Redgrave sleep with a box of nails under her bed?" Father Brown blinked. "Nails?" The child nodded. "I saw them when she let me fetch her slippers. A box, wooden. It looked heavy." He thanked her, then walked to the chapel. And there, in the dark of the empty pews, he knelt, not to pray, but to remember, because a box of nails, a wooden box, it wasn't nails, it was iron spikes, the kind used in very old crucifixes, the kind forged, not molded, the kind stained by more than age. That night, Father Brown visited the widow. She welcomed him in. Tea was offered, small talk followed, but her eyes darted every time the wind brushed the curtains. Her voice broke when he asked about her husband's final moments. "He died in his chair," she said, "with the rosary in hand, just like a good man should." "But Charles wasn't a religious man," Father Brown said softly. She froze. "He only came to Mass at Christmas," Father Brown continued, "and he never carried a rosary." She tried to smile. "People change when they know the end is near." "Yes," Father Brown said, "but the crucifix doesn't change, and I'm wondering why it never left his hands, even in death." Silence. Then she stood, quietly excused herself, and walked to the back room. When she returned, her hands were empty. But there was something in her eyes, something dark. "I should show you something," she whispered. She led him down the hall to the bedroom and bent down beside the bed. From beneath it, she slid out a wooden box, small, unadorned, locked. "I haven't opened it," she said. "I couldn't." Father Brown took the key from her trembling fingers and opened the latch. Inside was the crucifix. But it wasn't just a crucifix, it was the crucifix, the one that had gone missing after the death of Father Marcus, the one last seen with Edward Lacey before he was pulled from the river. And now, here it was, resting in velvet, its edges worn, its back engraved with a date that didn't match any known registry. But worse than that, much worse, was the dried blood, caked at its base, still red, still flaking, still fresh. The widow covered her mouth. "I didn't know," she gasped. "He kept it in the safe, said it was sacred, said it had to be hidden after—" "After what?" She didn't answer. That night, Father Brown returned to the chapel with the crucifix in hand, and as he walked through the nave, every candle flickered out, one by one, not from wind, from something else. He placed the crucifix on the altar, and the moment it touched the cloth, the bell tower rang once, but no one was there. And when he turned back to the crucifix, a drop of blood rolled from its edge. He cleaned it, hid it in the rectory, and waited. The next morning, Clara Redgrave was found unconscious in her home. No signs of forced entry, no signs of trauma. But beside her, on the floor, lay a second crucifix. Identical, but not the same one. The second was older, cracked down the center, and on the back, a different date, the year her first husband died. Father Brown didn't even know she had been married before. But now, there were 2 crucifixes, 2 dates, 2 deaths, and 1 widow. He confronted her when she awoke. She stared at him with hollow eyes. "I didn't kill them," she whispered. "I buried them." "Buried what?" "The sins," she said. "They were hiding inside the crosses." "What sins?" But she wouldn't answer. He left her home, went to the graveyard, and walked to Charles Redgrave's plot. The earth was still fresh, too fresh. He returned that night, alone, shovel in hand. He dug in silence, and when he reached the coffin, He opened it. Charles's face stared back, untouched, unaged. But his hands, they weren't holding a rosary. They were empty. The rosary had been a lie. He hadn't died praying. He had died screaming. The next day, Father Brown opened the second crucifix. Beneath the wood, wrapped in silk, was a tooth. Human. And not Charles's. He sent it for testing. It belonged to Father Marcus. He opened the first crucifix. Inside, a piece of paper. One sentence. Let them confess before they die. The widow hadn't killed them. She had made them speak, and then watched as something else punished them. The crucifixes weren't weapons. They were locks, holding confessions too vile to bear, too dangerous to release. And she had kept them all, because someone had to. Father Brown returned to the rectory and placed both crucifixes side by side. He prayed over them. And that night, he heard a knock at the door. 3 taps, slow, deliberate. He opened it. No one was there, but on the steps, one more crucifix, new, polished, and on its back, his own name, Father Brown. He picked it up, hands shaking. Inside, no tooth, no blood, only a mirror. He stared into it and saw someone standing behind him. When he turned, there was nothing. The next morning, Clara Redgrave was gone. The house locked, the windows dark. But the 3 crucifixes remained. 3 sins, 3 deaths, 1 truth, and a priest who had heard them all, but had never spoken. And when asked who she had really been, wife, widow, witch or watcher, Father Brown only said, "She hid the crucifix to protect us, not from her, from what listens when we pray." And then he placed all 3 beneath the altar and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 10. The bell rang for blood. The bell tolled 13 times that night, though the tower had only 12 gears. It was Father Brown who heard it first. The hour had long passed midnight. The candles in the chapel melted down to stubs, and the fog outside lay heavy as unspoken sin. No one should have been in the bell tower. No one had been in the bell tower for years, not since the night it last rang for death. But when the 13th toll echoed through the valley, every soul in Kembleford felt it reverberate beneath their ribs, like the sound had been meant for them alone. By dawn, there was blood on the church steps, not a body, just a trail of crimson, leading from the bell tower door to the altar, stopping neatly at the foot of the cross, as if someone had dragged their wounds there to pray before dying. Except there was no corpse, only blood, thick, fresh, and warm. Father Brown stood over it silently, eyes narrowed, breath visible in the cold morning air. "Someone has tried to wash their soul clean," he whispered, and failed. Mallory arrived moments later, already irritated. "Animal attack, probably, or one of your parishioners with a flair for the dramatic." But Father Brown pointed upward, to the bell tower window. "If that's true, Inspector," he said softly, "then why is there someone watching us from up there?" Mallory looked. The window was empty, but the rope hanging from the tower was swaying gently, as though a hand had just let it go. When they climbed the stairs, they found the rope slick with blood, and at the top, resting on the wooden beam beside the bell, a single object, a severed finger, wearing a gold ring engraved with a cross, the bishop's ring. The same bishop who had been buried 3 days ago. They opened the grave that afternoon. The coffin was empty, not desecrated, not disturbed, just empty. The wood was clean, the linen untouched, as though the body had never been there. The earth, however, told a different story. Blood seeped through it, like the grave itself was weeping. Mallory turned pale. "This is madness. Who opens a grave removes a bishop, and leaves a finger behind. Father Brown didn't answer. He was staring at the ring, because inside the band, scratched in by hand, was a single word: confess. He turned the ring over, saw something darker, a rusted line of blood beneath the gold. Not old blood, not from the bishop. "Someone's alive," he murmured, "and they want to be heard." That night, the bell rang again, once, then twice. Then it stopped. Halfway through the third toll, the rope went taut, jerking, as if something had caught it mid-air. Father Brown lit his lantern and began to climb. The air grew colder with each step, the scent of iron and old dust filling his lungs. And when he reached the top, he froze. There was a body hanging beside the bell. A man, upside down, his hands bound, his face bloodless. But the most terrifying thing, his eyes were open, and they were moving. Father Brown whispered a prayer, but the man's lips moved too, faintly, forming words that were barely sound. "Forgive me," he breathed. "I didn't mean to ring it." Then his neck snapped. Mallory found Father Brown in the tower an hour later, pale and trembling, staring at the corpse. "Who is he?" Mallory asked. Father Brown pointed to the man's coat. The clerical collar was torn. "He was a priest," Father Brown said, "but not one of ours." The dead man was identified as Father Edmund Clare, a name that hadn't been spoken in decades, a priest defrocked for falsifying death records. Records that coincidentally included the late Bishop Harrington. Except now, the bishop wasn't late at all. Father Brown went to the rectory, tore through the archives, searching for any mention of Clare's work. There, among the dusty ledgers and forgotten confessions, he found it, a sealed envelope marked, "In case the bell rings again." Inside was a single note: "The blood calls the guilty." And beneath it, a list of names. Every one of them a priest, every one of them dead, except for one: Father Brown's. The air in the rectory grew thick, almost unbreathable. The candle flame flickered out, leaving him in darkness. And then, from the bell tower, a sound again. Not the toll this time, a scream, high, long, agonized. By the time he reached the tower, the rope was still swinging. But there was no body this time, only the echo of footsteps descending the stairs. Slow, heavy, deliberate. He followed them down, heart hammering. The footprints glistened wetly, crimson against the stone floor. But when they reached the chapel door, they stopped, because the door was closed and locked from the inside. Father Brown tried the handle. It gave way. The chapel was empty, except for one thing. On the altar lay the bishop's ring, still glistening with blood, and beneath it, scrawled in what looked like the same, "You didn't bury me. You buried the wrong man." Mallory wanted to seal off the church. "This is madness. Graves don't swap bodies." But Father Brown shook his head. "Not madness," he said. "A message, and we've been too afraid to read it." He returned to the graveyard, lantern trembling in his hand. The fog had rolled in thick and low, muffling his steps, muting the world. And then, faintly, he heard it again. The bell. But this time, it wasn't coming from the tower. It was coming from underground, from the bishop's grave. He dropped to his knees and began to dig. The earth was wet, red with something that wasn't soil. His hands tore through it, clawing at the wood beneath until his fingers bled. When he finally pried the coffin open, the sound stopped. Inside, there was a bell, small, hand-sized, still vibrating, and beneath it, wrapped in linen, another hand. Not the bishop's, a woman's. The nails painted, the wrist branded with a symbol, a cross upside down, and around the wrist A rosary. He recognized it. It had belonged to Eleanor Caldwell, the girl who had died months ago in the nave, the girl whose murder had started all of this. He stumbled backward, horror in his chest. The bishop hadn't been buried alone, and someone wanted him to know. When he returned to the chapel, the bell was ringing again. Faster now. Wild. Desperate. Mallory ran in, gun drawn. "Who's up there?" Father Brown said nothing. He already knew. The rope was moving, but not pulled by any hand. It writhed, twisting, coiling like a living thing, and on the floor beneath it, a trail of blood, spelling a name. "Eleanor!" The bell stopped. Mallory looked pale. "Tell me this is a trick, Father." But Father Brown's eyes were distant, cold. "No, it's a confession." They sealed the tower after that, bricked it up, ordered no one to enter. But Father Brown couldn't rest. He knew something was unfinished. So, at midnight, he returned alone. Lantern, Bible, rope. He knocked once on the tower door, and it opened. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of iron and incense. The rope hung perfectly still. He climbed the stairs, and there, beside the bell, stood a woman. Or something that had once been one. Her face pale, streaked with earth, her dress torn, and in her hand, a small bell, cracked down the middle. "I tried to tell you," she whispered. "He made me ring it." Then she vanished. Gone. Only the echo of her voice lingered, carried through the tower like wind through a grave. The next morning, Mallory found Father Brown at the altar, eyes hollow, face grey. "The bishop wasn't the first," he said quietly. "He was the last." "The last what?" Father Brown looked up slowly. "The last guilty man. The bell doesn't call the innocent, Inspector. It calls those who have something to confess." Mallory frowned. "Then why did it ring last night?" Father Brown stared at the floor, his voice barely a whisper. "Because I finally heard the truth." He left the church that day, and the bell tower was sealed forever. But on stormy nights, when the wind howls through the valley, the villagers swear they can hear it tolling again, 13 times, each ring a warning, each ring a confession, each ring a reminder that some sins do not stay buried. And sometimes, when the thunder fades and the world goes still, there's a voice, Father Brown's voice, soft and weary, whispering through the static of memory. "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 11. A sin no priest forgave. He confessed to killing God, and the worst part was, Father Brown believed him. It was one of those nights when the air itself felt wrong. The moon hung low and swollen, bleeding light through the church windows like a wound that refused to close. The confessional was empty, or so Father Brown thought, until he heard breathing on the other side, slow, ragged, and human. He cleared his throat softly. "Go on, my child." The voice that answered was not trembling, not repentant. It was steady, cold. "Forgive me, Father," the man said, "for I have killed the only one who could forgive me." Father Brown froze. It wasn't the words, it was the way he said them. Like a man describing something he had already made peace with. "Whom do you mean?" Father Brown asked, trying to keep his voice calm. The answer came so softly, it was almost swallowed by the dark. "God." There was no laughter, no tremor, just silence. Then the man exhaled, long and low, as if releasing years of buried truth. "He bled," the man whispered. "He bled like anyone else." By the time Father Brown pushed open the confessional door, the other side was empty. The latch was still warm. The next morning, a body was found on the steps of the rectory. The church's caretaker, old Mr. Doran, lay face down in a pool of his own blood, his rosary wound tightly around his throat. But that wasn't the worst part. On the church door, written in blood, was a single word: absolved. The villagers whispered that it was a warning, that the devil had come for the priest. But Father Brown saw something else, something far older. The lettering was precise, curved in an elegant hand he recognized. It was the same handwriting that had once filled the church's confession ledger 20 years ago, when another priest had vanished without a trace. Father Alastair. They had buried an empty coffin. Mallory examined the body. "Looks like ritual," he muttered. "Maybe revenge." But Father Brown knew better. The way the rosary was tied, the particular knots, it was the binding ritual used in cases of penitent exorcism, the kind reserved for priests who had broken sacred oath. He turned to Mallory. Whoever did this wasn't trying to mock God, he was trying to silence him. That night, Father Brown lit candles for the dead. The wind outside howled like an open grave. He could hear the church wood creak as though someone were walking in the aisles. Then, faintly, the bell above rang once. He knew what that meant. Someone had entered. He turned towards the confessional. The curtain was drawn again. "Forgive me, Father," came the voice, quiet and near, "for I've remembered something terrible." The hair rose on the back of his neck. It was the same voice as before. Calm. Familiar. "You said you killed God," Father Brown said. "Explain yourself." "I did," the man replied, and he screamed. Father Brown's fingers tightened around the crucifix. "What do you mean?" "He begged for mercy," the man whispered, "and I did not forgive him." Silence stretched between them like a wound that refused to heal. Then the man continued, slower, like a prayer turned backward. "You were there, Father. You just didn't remember." Father Brown opened the curtain, but the other side was empty. In the booth lay a small brass key, marked with the symbol of a serpent eating its tail. He recognized it. The key to the crypt beneath the church. He descended the stairs that night, lantern in hand, every step echoing against cold stone. The crypt smelled of wax and something fouler. At the far end, he saw a coffin, standing upright against the wall, nailed shut, and carved into the wood. 3 words: "He is forgiven." Father Brown pulled the nails loose. The coffin door fell open. Inside was not a corpse, it was a mirror. He stared at his own reflection, horrified, and then he saw the writing scrawled across the glass in blood. "You buried me alive." His hand shook. Memories flickered in fragments. Years ago, a priest found guilty of blasphemy, locked away in the crypt until judgment. A man who had claimed to hear God's true voice. Father Alastair. But Father Alastair had not been executed. He had been sealed. Father Brown stumbled back, breathing hard. Someone had released him. The next morning, the village awoke to find the church doors wide open. Candles melted into pools of wax, and the altar cloth slashed with a blade. On it were written 6 names, men of the cloth, all dead, all buried within 10 miles of each other, and beneath the names, one phrase repeated over and over: "They forgave too much." Mallory paced, muttering, "We're chasing a ghost, Father." Father Brown didn't respond. He was staring at the names. One was missing, his own. That night, he went to his room and found a letter on his desk. No seal, no signature. Just a line written in that same perfect script. "Tonight, I will confess again." And sure enough, as the clock struck midnight, the confessional door creaked open. The same voice whispered, softer this time, as if amused, Do you know why no priest ever forgave me? Father Brown swallowed. Because you never repented. A pause, then a low, bitter laugh. No, because I told the truth. What truth? The man leaned close to the grate, his breath cold as frost. That sin was created to protect God, not to please him. And those who see the truth must die for it. Father Brown pressed his hand to the wall between them. Then why come to me? Because you lied. I don't lie. You did when you buried me, the voice hissed. Father Brown tore open the confessional curtain. This time, he was ready to see the face behind the voice. But there was no man, only a priest's collar nailed to the seat, and beneath it, a folded scrap of parchment. On it was written, "You heard my last confession." The handwriting was his own. He stared at the note, his pulse pounding. The ink was still wet. It didn't make sense until he saw the reflection in the confessional glass. Not his own face, but Father Alistair's, smiling. The next morning, Mallory found Father Brown pacing outside the rectory, muttering to himself. The sin wasn't in what he did, he whispered, but in what he knew. They exhumed Father Alistair's grave again, just to be sure. The coffin was filled, this time with a body, but not his. Father Brown's cassock, his Bible, his rosary, everything that belonged to him. Inside the Bible, one verse was circled in red, John 20:23. Whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven. Whose you retain, they are retained. He realized what the voice had meant. The power of forgiveness was not divine, it was human. And that meant it could be corrupted. Someone had used confession as a weapon. Father Brown dug deeper, searching through old ledgers, tracing back confessions that had led to deaths. There was a pattern. Every forgiveness had been followed by punishment. It wasn't salvation, it was judgment. And the last entry in the old ledger was written in unfamiliar ink. He forgave me, so I took his sin. Father Brown turned the page and saw his own handwriting continuing it. He didn't die, he became me. He closed the book and whispered, "That's not possible." But then the church bell rang. Once, twice, 13 times. He rushed to the nave, heart racing. The candles had lit themselves. The confessional glowed faintly, curtain fluttering. He stepped inside. On the seat lay a crucifix, snapped clean in two, and beneath it, a small mirror, cracked through the center. In its reflection, behind him, stood a figure in priest's robes. "Father," the voice said gently, "I'm here to be forgiven." Father Brown turned slowly. The face was his own. The figure smiled faintly. "You buried me once, remember?" Then it faded, leaving only the echo of breath. The next morning, the church stood empty. Mallory found the confessional charred, the mirror shattered, and one phrase burned into the wall. Some sins are not meant to be forgiven. And from that day forward, no priest in Kembleford ever offered confession alone. Because sometimes, in the dead silence before dawn, the church bell rings 13 times, and a voice whispers from the dark, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 12. The cross burned. At midnight, they say the cross had stood there for nearly 2 centuries, weather-beaten, hollow with rot, and carved by a mason whose name was never known. But that night, at precisely midnight, it burned, not with the soft flicker of candle flame or the cruel chaos of lightning-struck timber. No, this flame moved like it was alive, like it had waited. It curled upwards in silence, not even crackling, and it burned without smoke. By morning, the iron nails at its base had melted to black glass, and in their place was something even more disturbing. Father Brown's name, etched into scorched earth, as though the fire had written it. The villagers of Pendlebrook had long whispered about the old chapel grounds, but after the fire, they stopped whispering and started locking doors. Because 3 nights before, the Reverend had vanished, and 5 nights before that, someone had torn the confession box from the church wall with such force that the bolts snapped like dry twigs. And now someone, or something, had desecrated the holiest symbol in the parish. But what chilled Father Brown more than the fire, more than the silence that followed, was what he saw buried beneath the ash. A single communion wafer, unburned, unbroken, placed like a coin over the eye of the ground. He said nothing at first, simply bent, picked it up with trembling fingers, and slid it into his coat pocket, not out of sacrilege, out of terror, because he recognized the pattern pressed into the wafer's surface. Not the usual cross, no. This one was a spiral, the kind etched onto ancient altars, the kind never meant for mass. By dawn, the air reeked of something sweet, too sweet. Honeysuckle in winter, sugar over rot. It was the same smell that had clung to the handkerchief found inside the Reverend's locked study, tied with a child's lace ribbon and stiff with something brown. Mrs. Ashcombe, the choir mistress, was the first to break. She arrived at Father Brown's door in a dressing gown, her hair wild, her eyes red. She told him she had seen it, the cross, blazing like a torch, but giving off no heat. She told him she heard chanting, no humming, from somewhere beneath the chapel, as though the stone itself were singing. And then she handed him a page torn from the hymnal, number 96, "Let all mortal flesh keep silence." But the lyrics had been scrawled over, rewritten. "Let all mortal flesh be silent, for the blood has not yet cooled." Father Brown sat for a long time after she left, the wafer in one hand, the hymnal page in the other. And then, without telling anyone, he walked straight to the chapel ruins and began digging with his bare hands. 6 inches beneath the soil, he found what he expected, and what he feared: a second cross, smaller, newer, bound in wire, not wood, and at its center a scrap of cloth from the Reverend's robe, threaded through with red wax. The police were called, of course, but they found nothing. No remains, no accelerant, no reason, no suspect. Only a priest with dirt under his nails, a village too afraid to speak, and a chapel that had begun whispering again when the wind blew east. Father Brown returned to the rectory that evening and locked the communion cabinet for the first time in 15 years. He lit a candle and waited. Midnight came, the candle guttered, and the door to the rectory creaked open. It was not the wind. A figure stood in the doorway, face hidden by shadow, a cross-shaped burn seared across the front of their cassock. They held something out in both hands, something small, wrapped in altar linen. Father Brown took it. It was the Reverend's journal. Inside, a single line on the last page. "I did not take confession, I gave it, and the sin was never forgiven." Father Brown looked up, but the doorway was empty. No footsteps, no retreating figure, just the sharp scent of honeysuckle again, curling around the candle's flame. He turned back to the journal, to the faint smudges of ash around the edges, to the one page torn out and tucked between the final entries. A map, not of the chapel, of the cemetery. There, beneath a crooked willow marked with a spiral, a grave that did not belong to any known villager. No headstone, no record, but freshly turned earth. He knew where he must go, and he knew what he would find. But he also knew something far more disturbing. Someone else already knew that he knew. And this time, not even God would bear witness. The candle went out, and Father Brown whispered the only words that could end such a thing. I know who did it, but the truth will never be told.